The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin, a familiar backdrop for passengers settling into their seats for the long flight ahead. Conversations bubbled softly as flight attendants moved briskly up and down the aisle, offering assistance and preparing for takeoff. Most people were either scrolling through their phones, chatting with their seatmates, or gazing out the small windows at the endless expanse of tarmac. It was an ordinary flight, or so it seemed. Toward the middle of the plane, a tall man with a commanding presence was visibly irritated. His sharp, impatient gestures and muttered complaints had already drawn a few sideways glances from nearby passengers. Dressed in business casual attire, he exuded an air of entitlement, the type of person accustomed to having things his way. He had been mumbling about his seat being too close to the restroom, the overhead bin being too small, and even the temperature of the air conditioning. Across the aisle from him sat a woman with an air of quiet dignity. Her dark curls framed her face, and her calm demeanor was a sharp contrast to the man's restless energy. She wore a comfortable yet elegant outfit, and the book she held in her hands suggested she was more interested in passing the time peacefully than engaging with the surrounding chaos. Despite her serene appearance, there was something about her presence that commanded respect, a quiet strength that wasn't immediately obvious but undeniable to those who paid attention. As the plane began to taxi to the runway, a slight commotion drew the attention of several passengers. The man had decided to voice his complaints more loudly, gesturing toward the woman seated across from him. His tone was dismissive, his words sharp, though their exact meaning was muffled by the engines. It was clear, however, that he was directing his frustration at her, despite her having done nothing to provoke him. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Most were reluctant to intervene, unsure of how the situation might escalate. The woman, however, remained composed, her eyes never leaving his as he continued his tirade. A calm seemed to frustrate him even more, and his voice grew louder, drawing the attention of a nearby flight attendant. "Sir, I need you to lower your voice," the flight attendant said firmly, stepping in to de-escalate the situation. "We haven't even taken off yet. Let's keep this calm, okay?" The man barely acknowledged her, muttering something under his breath before turning back to face forward. But the tension lingered heavy and unspoken as the plane finally lifted into the sky. As the hours wore on, the man's agitation didn't fade. It simmered beneath the surface, erupting now and then in muttered complaints or exaggerated sighs. It was clear that he felt justified in his actions, as though the world owed him an apology for his discomfort. What he didn't realize, what no one yet knew, was that his behavior was being closely observed. The woman's stoic demeanor hadn't gone unnoticed. In fact, a few passengers had begun whispering among themselves, sharing hushed speculation about who she might be. There was something almost regal about her, something that didn't quite align with the everyday. But the man, blinded by his self-centered frustration, had failed to notice the subtle reactions around him. As the plane approached cruising altitude, the woman calmly closed her book and stood, stretching slightly before making her way toward the back of the plane. The man watched her go, a faint smirk on his face, as though he believed he had somehow won the unspoken battle. But if he had known the truth, if he had any idea who she really was, his smug satisfaction would have turned to cold dread. Moments later, a faint ripple of energy spread through the cabin. Passengers who had remained silent during the earlier incidents suddenly began glancing toward the back of the plane, where whispers grew louder. The flight attendant who had earlier intervened now wore a look of quiet urgency as she moved toward the cockpit, her expression unreadable. And then the man made a critical mistake. Emboldened by what he perceived as the woman's retreat, he leaned across the aisle and loudly commented on her absence, his words cutting and laden with unnecessary malice. The cabin fell into an uneasy silence as his voice carried, echoing above the hum of the engines. What happened next would change everything. The man didn't yet know it, but the very person he had so casually dismissed was someone he could never have anticipated. Behind him, unnoticed for now, someone was approaching, someone who had been observing the events quietly but was no longer willing to stay silent. As their shadow fell across the man's seat, his smirk faltered, the air around him suddenly heavy with an unshakable sense of foreboding. The confrontation was inevitable, and as the tension reached its breaking point, every passenger on the plane seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The man felt the shift in the cabin's atmosphere before he saw its source. The soft hum of murmurs among passengers had quieted, replaced by an almost oppressive silence. He straightened in his seat, his smirk fading as he glanced over his shoulder. Someone was standing behind him, a presence he couldn't ignore, even though he hadn't yet turned fully to see who it was. The woman he had antagonized earlier was still nowhere in sight, but this new figure carried an air of authority that made the man's confidence waver. It wasn't just the way they stood, tall and composed, but the way the nearby passengers seemed to shrink in their seats, their eyes darting away as if they didn't want to be caught staring. "Excuse me," came a calm, steady voice. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the tension like a blade. The man froze, suddenly aware that every eye in the cabin was now on him. He turned slowly, his bravado faltering as he met the gaze of the person standing behind him. The figure wasn't imposing in size, but there was something in their expression, a quiet intensity that made the man's earlier bravado feel small and ridiculous. The person didn't say anything else, just held his gaze, waiting. For a moment, the man considered doubling down, brushing off the encounter as if it were nothing. But something about the way the stranger was looking at him made him hesitate. It was then that he noticed a subtle but significant detail, the badge clipped to the stranger's chest. It wasn't flashy, but its meaning was unmistakable. This wasn't just another passenger. This was someone with authority, someone who could make decisions that would affect far more than just his comfort on this flight. "Is there a problem?" the stranger asked, their tone still calm but carrying an undercurrent of warning. The man opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. He felt a bead of sweat form on his temple, and for the first time, he realized just how precarious his situation was. He glanced around the cabin, searching for support, but the other passengers avoided his gaze. They weren't going to help him, not after what they'd witnessed earlier. As the man struggled to find his footing, his mind raced back to the events that had led him here. He hadn't meant for things to escalate the way they had. It had started with something small, a minor inconvenience, a delay in boarding. By the time he'd taken his seat, he was already in a foul mood. The woman across the aisle had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, or at least, that's what he told himself. But even as he tried to justify his actions, a small voice in the back of his mind reminded him that he'd crossed a line. He let his frustration boil over, lashing out at someone who had done nothing to deserve it. And now he was paying the price. The figure behind him didn't move, didn't speak again. They simply stood there, waiting. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. The man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier confidence now completely gone. He wanted to apologize, to explain himself, but the words felt hollow even before they formed in his mind. As the seconds ticked by, the man's thoughts turned to the woman he had targeted. Who was she? Why had she reacted the way she did, with calm instead of anger? And why did it feel like her absence was more significant than her presence? There was something about her that he couldn't quite place, something that lingered in his mind even as he tried to push it away. The flight attendant who had intervened earlier appeared again, her expression professional but tense. She approached the stranger with a nod, speaking in hushed tones that the man couldn't quite hear. Whatever they were saying, it was clear that the situation wasn't being dismissed. Meanwhile, the other passengers exchanged glances, their curiosity palpable. Whispers began to ripple through the cabin, fragments of speculation drifting like smoke. Some wondered if the woman was someone important, a public figure traveling incognito. Others suggested she might be connected to the airline or even law enforcement. But no one knew for sure, and the uncertainty only added to the tension. As the flight attendant stepped away, the man finally found his voice, though it was shaky and unconvincing. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "It was just a misunderstanding. I was frustrated, that's all." The stranger didn't respond immediately, their gaze steady and unyielding. When they finally spoke, their voice was measured, almost clinical. Frustration doesn't justify your behavior. Words have consequences, and so do actions. The man felt his throat tighten. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the weight of the stranger's words was undeniable. He glanced around the cabin again, hoping for some sort of reprieve, but none came. The passengers who had once been silent observers were now quietly judging him, their expressions a mix of disapproval and curiosity. In the midst of his growing panic, a memory surfaced, something he had read in the in-flight magazine while waiting to board. It had been an article about notable figures in the aviation industry, highlighting individuals who had made significant contributions to safety and innovation. One of the profiles had caught his eye, though he hadn't paid much attention at the time. It was about a woman, a trailblazer in her field, known for her composure under pressure and her unwavering dedication to equality and justice. The man's heart sank as he realized why the woman across the aisle had seemed familiar. He couldn't remember her name, but he was certain now that she was the same person he had read about, a leader, an advocate, and someone far more influential than he had ever imagined. Panic set in as the implications of his actions became clear. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. He had insulted someone who commanded respect on a global scale, someone whose reputation could dismantle his own with a single word. And judging by the way the stranger behind him was watching him, it was obvious that his behavior hadn't gone unnoticed. The man's mind raced, searching for a way out of the mess he had created. But no matter how he spun it, there was no escaping the truth. He had made a grave mistake. And now, as the plane continued its journey through the skies, he was left to face the consequences. The question wasn't if he would be held accountable, it was how. The man's pulse raced as he tried to focus on anything but the weight of the situation. He felt trapped, not just by the confined space of the airplane, but by the judgmental stares and the silent presence of the figure still standing behind him. He wished for the flight to end, for the chance to fade into the anonymity of the airport terminal, but the hours stretching ahead felt like an eternity. The hum of the engines seemed louder now, filling the silence that hung heavy in the cabin. He glanced toward the seat across the aisle, where the woman had been earlier, but it was still empty. That emptiness seemed to mock him, reminding him of the disdain he had so carelessly thrown her way. What he wouldn't get to take it all back, to undo the words that had set this chain of events in motion. A few rows back, an older couple exchanged whispers, their voices too low to make out, but their glances told him everything he needed to know. They weren't talking about the weather or the in-flight meal. They were talking about him. He could feel their disapproval, sharp and unrelenting, and it gnawed at him in a way he hadn't expected. As the man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the flight attendant returned, her expression more serious now. She leaned down and spoke to the figure behind him in hushed tones, their conversation just out of earshot. The man strained to catch a word, but all he could pick up was the occasional nod or glance in his direction. Whatever they were discussing, it clearly wasn't good news for him. Meanwhile, the passengers around him were no longer trying to hide their curiosity. A young woman a few rows ahead kept glancing back, her phone held low as though she might be recording. A middle-aged man across the aisle pretended to read his book but kept flicking his eyes upward, his interest poorly concealed. It was as though the entire cabin had become a theater, and he was the unwitting star of a performance he wanted no part in. The woman he had insulted still hadn't returned, and her absence was becoming more unsettling with every passing minute. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was in control of this situation, even though she wasn't physically present. It was as if the entire plane was waiting for her to make the next move, and the anticipation was suffocating. His thoughts drifted to her again, to the quiet confidence she had exuded as she calmly endured his outburst. There had been no anger in her eyes, no flinch at his words, only a steady, unwavering gaze that now seemed far more powerful in hindsight. He realized that her silence had spoken louder than any rebuttal ever could, and it was that silence that haunted him now. The stranger behind him finally moved, stepping forward to speak with the flight attendant. Their voices were still low, but there was an urgency to their exchange. The man caught a few words this time: protocol, documentation, and arrival, but they only deepened his confusion. What kind of protocol? What documentation? And why did it feel like his fate was being decided without him? In his growing anxiety, the man's mind began to wander to the possibilities. What if the woman was someone with significant influence? Someone who could make a single call and turn his life upside down? The thought terrified him, but what scared him even more was the possibility that this was already happening. He didn't know who she was, but he was starting to understand that she wasn't just anyone. As the minutes dragged on, a new layer of tension emerged among the passengers. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was unease. Some of them seemed to sense that this was no ordinary in-flight squabble, and their whispers took on a more urgent tone. The young woman with the phone was now openly recording, her camera pointed discreetly toward the aisle. The older couple had stopped whispering altogether, their expressions a mix of concern and apprehension. The man finally worked up the courage to speak. "Look, I don't know what's going on here," he said, his voice lower now, almost pleading. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble. It was just a misunderstanding, that's all." The stranger turned to him, their expression unreadable. "A misunderstanding doesn't excuse disrespect," they said evenly. "You don't get to choose how your words affect others." The man opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He felt like a child being scolded, powerless and exposed. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but deep down he knew they were right. He had crossed a line, and now he was facing the consequences. Just then, the woman returned. She moved down the aisle with the same quiet grace she had shown earlier, her expression calm but purposeful. She didn't look at him as she passed, but her presence was enough to make his stomach churn. She spoke briefly with the flight attendant, her voice low but steady, and then took her seat across the aisle. For a moment, the man considered apologizing. He rehearsed the words in his head, trying to find the right tone, the right phrasing. But every version felt empty, insincere, and as he glanced at her, he realized she wasn't even looking at him. She was focused on something far beyond him, something he couldn't understand. The flight attendant returned once more, this time carrying a small clipboard. She handed it to the woman, who began to write with deliberate precision. The man's heart sank as he realized what was happening. This wasn't over. Wherever she was writing, it was going to follow him long after the flight had landed. The rest of the passengers watched in silence, their earlier whispers now replaced by a heavy anticipation. The man felt like the walls of the cabin were closing in, the air growing thinner with every breath. He was no longer just a passenger on this flight. He was a spectacle, a lesson, a story that would be told long after they landed. And yet, he still didn't know how it would end. The tension in the cabin became almost unbearable as the woman finished writing on the clipboard and handed it back to the flight attendant. The man couldn't take his eyes off her, even though she still hadn't glanced in his direction. Her calm demeanor, her deliberate actions, it all felt like part of a larger plan, one he couldn't decipher but knew would have consequences. Around him, the murmurs of the other passengers had become quieter but no less intense. Their curiosity now seemed tinged with anticipation, as though they sensed something significant was about to happen. The young woman with the phone was still recording, her lens subtly capturing every detail, while the older couple exchanged pointed looks, their unease growing by the second. The man's mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. What was on that clipboard? What had she written, and who would see it? He thought about her earlier words, the strength in her tone when she called out his behavior without raising her voice. He thought about the stranger who had stood behind him, their steady, watchful presence. And he thought about how badly he had underestimated her, how his careless words had spiraled into something far beyond his control. The flight attendant returned to the front of the plane, handing the clipboard to another crew member. There was a brief exchange of words before one of them disappeared behind the curtain leading to the cockpit. The man's stomach tightened at the sight. It felt like a formal report was being made, and he was the subject of it. Whatever was happening, it was moving quickly now, and he was powerless to stop it. As the plane continued its journey, the woman across the aisle finally broke her silence. She leaned slightly toward the flight attendant, her voice low but clear. "I appreciate you handling this professionally," she said, "but I'll need to follow up with the appropriate channels once we land. This isn't just about me, it's about accountability." Her words sent a jolt of panic through the man. Follow-up? Accountability? Those weren't terms that suggested this would all blow over. They were terms that implied permanence, consequences, and impact that would reach far beyond the confines of this flight. He wanted to speak up, to defend himself, to explain that he hadn't meant for things to go this far. But the weight of his guilt kept him silent, pinned in place like a moth under glass. The flight continued in a strange, uneasy quiet. The passengers seemed reluctant to speak too loudly or move too much, as though any action might disrupt the fragile balance of the situation. Even the usual sounds of a flight, the rustling of snack wrappers, the hum of quiet conversations, felt muted, overtaken by the tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud. The man's thoughts spiraled as he tried to piece together what might happen next. Would there be authorities waiting for him when they landed? Would his name end up in a report, tied forever to this moment of shame? The idea of cameras flashing, of headlines that reduced him to a single damning act, filled him with a dread he couldn't shake. He wanted to believe it wouldn't come to that, but the certainty in the woman's voice and the determination in her actions told him otherwise. At one point, the stranger behind him leaned forward, their voice just loud enough for him to hear. "You're starting to understand, aren't you?" They said quietly. "Actions have consequences. It's not always about what you intended, it's about what you caused." The man didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth of those words settled over him like a heavy weight, pressing down on his chest and making it hard to breathe. He thought about everything that had led to this moment, every choice he had made, every word he had said. He thought about how easy it had been to dismiss the woman, to treat her as though she didn't matter. And now he was beginning to realize just how wrong he had been. As the plane began its descent, the tension in the cabin reached a fever pitch. The passengers exchanged nervous glances, their curiosity now tinged with apprehension. The man could feel their eyes on him, even when he wasn't looking. He could hear the faint whispers, the speculation about what might happen when they landed, and through it all, the woman across the aisle remained calm, her focus unshaken. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their approach to the airport. The man's pulse quickened as he realized the moment of truth was fast approaching. He glanced out the window, the city lights below a blur of movement and color. It was a strange contrast to the stillness he felt inside, a stillness born of fear and regret. As the plane touched down, the man's hands gripped the armrests so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He didn't know what awaited him on the other side of the flight, but he knew it was coming, and there was no way to avoid it. The woman across the aisle gathered her belongings with the same calm precision she had shown throughout the flight. She still hadn't looked at him, but her presence was impossible to ignore. The plane taxied to the gate, and the passengers began to stir, the tension in the cabin shifting into a different kind of energy. The man's heart pounded as he waited, his mind racing with possibilities. He didn't know what the next moments would bring, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over, not by a long shot.